All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the September Forum, New York State Environmental Bond Act and the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. My name is Harris Krzmanich. I'm a volunteer with GreenHomeNYC. For those of you who don't know, GreenHome is a nonprofit, all volunteer-run organization that's been around for over 2 decades, or just about 2 decades this year. Our mission is to promote a more sustainable built environment, and we do this mainly through 3 educational programs. First, there's the careers event, which focuses on promoting green professional development, networking opportunities, a lot of face-to-face interaction and education. Next, there's the tours, which provides an opportunity for people to walk through various energy efficient buildings and to see sustainable businesses. And then lastly, there are the forums, which you're all here tonight for. That includes presentations and panel discussions with experts on various topics dealing with sustainability. So if you're already not following us and subscribe to our newsletter, please do so. It's the best way to get caught up with our future events and to see articles that we share and so forth. And of course, as I mentioned before, we are an all volunteer organization. So if you have interest in volunteering, please reach out to forums@greenhomenyc.org. So on to tonight's forum. We're starting with presentations, and then afterwards we're going to have a Q&A. So feel free to type your questions into the chat as you think of them, and then we'll come back at the end and kind of have like a dialogue. I'd like to mention that this is our annual policy forum dedicated to the late Patty Noonan. We had these memorial forums for her because she was instrumental in progressing sustainable affordable housing in New York. She's had a huge impact on environmental policy, and it's important to celebrate and share her legacy. And being both a friend to the New York League of Conservation Voters and GreenHome, I find this forum very apt and well suited for the occasion. And with that, and speaking of New York League of Conservation Voters, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Matthew Salton. Let me just stop my screen share here. There you go. All right, Matt, all yours.
Okay, thanks so much. Hi, I'm Matt Salton. I'm the Federal Campaigns Manager at League of Conservation Voters. I have New York League of Conservation Voters, but I also oversee League of Conservation Voters for Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey as well. So I basically act as a go-between the states and the federal government. And what I've been doing now, what I've been breathing and eating and sleeping is the Inflation Reduction Act, because it's this massive project that is now officially underway after the bill was officially signed. So I'm just going to share my presentation here. Okay, so basically the Inflation Reduction Act, this massive package that just was signed into law by President Biden a little more than a month ago. There is so much to it, and people really aren't sure where to start. So as you can see from this little infographic, what is the IRA? It's clean energy, it's transportation, it's agriculture, it's healthy communities, it's buildings, it's clean manufacturing, and it's public lands and water. This is a historic piece of legislation that dips its toes into all of these areas. And this is just the environmental provision side. There are all those other health benefit and healthcare provisions that you've also heard about negotiating drug prices with Medicare. And it's about enforcing tax laws. So billion-dollar corporations will actually pay something in taxes. And that's sort of what goes to fund all of these incredible environmental provisions that I'm about to get into. So a quick summary of the benefits. The goal of the Inflation Reduction Act is a few things. It's to lower our carbon emissions to curb the effects of anthropogenic climate change, all while creating green jobs, good paying jobs for the American people, and to boost American manufacturing and make the American economy competitive in the 21st century. So at our current trajectory, with the Inflation Reduction Act, we are going to achieve roughly 40% climate emission reduction by 2030. Now, the US has committed under the Paris Accords that we'll have a 50% reduction by 2030. And by adopting the Inflation Reduction Act and going on the state and municipal level, we can then achieve that extra bit and meet our goals if we really ramp up our actions now. So I like to say that the Inflation Reduction Act is an interactive piece of legislation. It's basically democracy itself. It's allowing people to take control over their own decisions when it comes to energy. It allows you and incentivizes you to replace your appliances or your car or the way you get your energy or anything else to do with your energy footprint and what your community looks like. So it will lower costs, it'll lower inflation, as the name says, and it will create up to 9 million new jobs that will all be prevailing wage and union jobs, and all while lowering air emissions, lowering air pollution, which will avert 3,900 premature deaths a year and 100,000 asthma attacks yearly by 2030. And this is all taking place primarily through the federal tax code. So there's a lot to dive in here. So let's just look at this graphic for 1 second. These are US greenhouse gas emissions, and they are estimates about what our current policy would be doing. We're doing quite a bit right now on the state and local level. And if we just kept going with that, we would achieve 24 to 35% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. But because of the Inflation Reduction Act, we can go up to anywhere as high as 44% of a reduction of our emissions. And that's because we're investing in the clean energy we're producing. And then we're also converting fossil fuel infrastructure to work off of electricity. So it's twofold. It's making everything run on electricity, and then it's ensuring that we have enough electricity production and enough storage so that the grid is resilient enough to handle that kind of load. So the main thing, clean energy. Previously, we've had tax credits and other incentives that have been either a yearly basis or maybe once in a lifetime. Now we have basically every single year for 10 years, we have things fully funded. We have tax incentives for clean energy, storage, and interconnection projects. These are big deals. If you want to build a solar farm or a wind farm, traditionally you have to go to a very large bank, you get a loan, and they are taking equity within your project. And then these financial incentives, such as tax credits, will then go about 30% to those institutions because they're taking the risk by actually financing your project. Now, not everyone can afford to go and get really big banks to get invested in their projects because they're simply not big enough to do so. Things like nonprofits, co-ops, and municipal governments can't really go about doing that. So this bill does something really great with that. Rather than give tax credits, which you have to have a certain tax liability to apply for, this gives direct pay to nonprofits, co-ops, and government entities to do that. So it's just an incredible incentive for these to deploy green energy all over the place, regardless of scale. You don't have to be a huge company to start doing this. These programs and these funds will allow you to do that. The other thing it does is that it helps low income and rural communities do these sorts of things as well. There are a lot of incentives here that are specifically for those communities that have been disproportionately displaced because of fossil fuel infrastructure or gas production. I'm sure you can think of natural gas plant or any other kind of fossil fuel infrastructure in a certain neighborhood. And it was put there strategically because no one thought anyone would mind, because that community did not have the kind of political capital to oppose it that some more affluent communities do have. So that's sort of on the clean energy end. That's the financial incentive part, but this isn't just money, this is standards. So the methane emissions reduction program will incentivize and penalize those oil and gas industry actors who fail to curb leaks and waste of natural gas, such as methane, when they're transporting it. Now, natural gas, when you burn it, is not as carbon intensive or as much of a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide, but when it leaks without being burned, it's much more potent. And in the past, they have just sort of gotten off scot-free when they leak. Now there will be a program in place to incentivize and to penalize so that these leaks don't happen, so that we are seeing less global heating chemicals go into the atmosphere. So I'm not going to cover everything on these slides because they're kind of dense, but I just thought that it was important to have all of it up so that you can read them if you wanted to get something else that I don't cover. Transportation. Transportation actually accounts for the highest amount of carbon in our economy right now. It used to be energy production, but because of the upscale of renewables and the shutdown of coal plants, now it's actually transportation. So the big thing here are electric vehicles, the EV tax credits, which I'm sure you've all heard about because they've been making the rounds in the media. This is the big ticket item. So electric vehicle tax credits are up to $7,500 for new vehicles, and that's dependent on where it's made, because it has to be finally assembled in North America, and it depends on where the battery was made, and there are certain year increments depending on which qualify and which don't. Now, the 7,500 figure might sound familiar to a lot of you because that used to be the tax credit, but with that figure came a cap of 200,000 units produced. So Tesla, GM, Toyota, these companies have all exceeded that cap. So if you were to buy one of those, you could not get these tax credits. Really, any EV manufacturer, except for the really luxury models, have all gone past this. So they took that cap away. So now it just applies to any vehicle that meets those requirements. So that's just buying the car. But what's really fun about this and exciting is that it also incentivizes people to produce these cars in the United States, and which would cut down on supply chain issues, which would cut down on costs, and it would ensure that we have better jobs here instead of shipping off overseas. So it also incentivizes the infrastructure for these EVs. You can get charging ports for your home. There's a special incentive there if you live in a rural community or you live in a low-income urban community. There are investments in the general infrastructure alongside with the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed earlier this year. There's money in there for support for sustainable aviation fuels, finding low carbon ways to fuel airplanes, for example, and not just personal transportation, but also for business. These tax credits are available for if you want to buy cars for your businesses, but also if you want to buy light duty trucks for your businesses, or such as UPS trucks for the UPS, or school buses for your local schools. And there are also credits for long haul truckers with very large, multi-wheeled trucks. So there's just a lot in here to tackle transportation, which is the #1 cause of emissions right now. So not much of this matters unless communities benefit from it. And historically speaking, environmental justice communities and frontline communities are the ones who bear the brunt of a lot of air pollution. We see it in New York, up in Harlem, there are fewer trees and there's more air pollution rather than some of the more affluent areas of the city. So a lot of these provisions in here target that kind of discrimination and try to roll back the environmental injustices we have seen. One of those is a $3 billion environmental and climate justice block grant program to help reduce that pollution and reduce those climate threats. It also targets Superfund sites and actually puts a tax on oil companies to fund these cleanups. Finally, we have a ton of cleanup. We have a ton of Superfund sites rather in New York and the surrounding area, and this will actually fund the cleanup of those. The people who polluted will now have to pay for the cleanup. Clean manufacturing, like I said, this is going to be a jobs boom for the United States. And there are incentives for clean energy manufacturing, making all the things that we actually need to transition to a clean energy economy, and also the ways to transport it, whether that be incentives in the grid or storage or anything else. This is going to help just absolutely explode the amount of things we are making in the United States. One of the things that I think is pretty exciting is the employment and $500 million for the Defense and Production Act for priorities in clean energy manufacturing. That includes heat pumps, which I know that this coalition talks a lot about, this group talks a lot about, and we talk a lot about in New York City. So talking about buildings. Because in New York City, buildings are the biggest source of emissions because we don't drive as much as other places. The fastest way to cut down on emissions is to cut down the emissions of buildings. And the Defense and Production Act is also being employed to make more heat pumps. If you suddenly go apartment by apartment and replace each air conditioner and water boiler with a heat pump, just air source, or a heat pump that is tied to a water boiler, and you do that in every single apartment, you've suddenly decarbonized the entire building without really trying or doing it on a coordinated effort. So that's one of the ways that this is actually where the rubber meets the road, and it's taking emissions out of the air by putting up green energy alternatives. So agriculture, not much impact here in New York City, but still some, where we're putting $21 billion investments toward conservation programs, climate smart agricultural practices. We see that with urban farming, and we'll be covered with some of that. There's also areas for rural communities that will get money for clean energy projects and rural electric co-ops. And there will also be $5 billion to protect and restore forests, because we need to restore our natural carbon sink, not just putting CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, but also the natural solutions to that as well. So public lands and waters, again, we don't have too much of these in New York that really affect us, but it will be a boon to offshore wind projects, and it will give more money to the MPS to do things with conservation projects and help with coastal restoration projects, which actually do affect us a lot in New York. Hurricanes Irene and Sandy have just devastated our communities last year, Ida, and this will help us restore some of our coastal protections against those. Now, the bill isn't perfect. It also requires future onshore and offshore oil and gas leases sales as a prerequisite for holding renewable energy lease sales on public lands. These are some of the things that Senator Manchin required to be in the bill for its passage. It also provides for cancel or disputed offshore drilling leases in the Gulf of Mexico and off Alaska. And LCV will be pushing back on those, trying to ensure that no communities are harmed as a result of any of these projects. So the last thing I'll leave you on is this: the website that the White House just put out about climate. It's a good resource to sort of go on and see what can I get right now, because a lot of these programs are staggered throughout the next 10 years. So some of them aren't going to be available right away. Some of them you're going to have to wait till January. Some of them you want to wait till 2023. Some you want to wait till 2024. Others you want to wait a little longer. So this website will help you sort of navigate that space. So I think the main thing here that I want to really highlight is that this is the boldest piece of climate legislation that we've ever seen in the United States. And we're just going to keep talking about it because it really requires people to buy into it. It requires people to take advantage of these tax incentives and credits and programs, because if we don't, then it's not going to work. So it really does require people to get involved and people to take advantage, and which will in turn save them money and save the air from more pollution. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. That was a really, really great overview. And I like how you kind of talked about how it really affects New York City and the state of New York. And now we're going to have Andrew Williams, also from New York League of Conservation Voters. He's going to speak to the Bond Act, which is that is just a New York State piece of legislation, so it'll be even narrower focus. So with that said, Andrew, all yours.
Great, thanks, Harris. Yeah, like Harris said, I'm Andrew Williams. I am the Deputy State Policy Director for the New York League of Conservation Voters. I am actually based up in Albany, unlike the rest of my colleagues, but I'm going to give you a good overview of the New York State Environmental Bond Act. And here I'm going to share my screen here shortly. Okay, so this November, on the back of our ballots will be ballot proposition number 1. This is the New York State Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Bond Act, commonly known in Albany and around the state as the Environmental Bond Act. It's a very long name. So what is the Bond Act? The Clean Water and Air and Green Jobs Bond Act is a ballot measure that New York voters will have the opportunity to vote on November 8th. And if passed, it will protect clean water, uplift public health and environmental protection, and improve quality of life in every county around the state. So this is a ballot proposition, but it took a while to get us here. If you're not familiar with how bond acts work on the state level, they have to be passed by both houses of the legislature, signed by the governor. This time around, it happened in the budget process. And it allows the state to allow the comptroller to issue bonds and acquire debt. So these aren't, everyday ballot initiatives. We're really only allowed to have one bond act on the ballot at one time. So it's actually been 26 years since the last Environmental Bond Act came on our ballots around New York State. And in the history of the state, we've only had 11. Of that, only 10 or all but 1 have passed. So we have a good track record, but it's not something that happens all the time. So what will the Bond Act do? It addresses the biggest challenge that the face is facing, and that's climate change and more extreme weather events, and modernizing our grid, and just preparing our state to face the challenges that are going to be happening as we move into the future. So it creates jobs, it invests in disadvantaged communities, while at the same time tackling the challenges facing us. In this Bond Act, there will be money to protect clean drinking water, modernize our infrastructure and revitalize the economy, improve public health and safety, and conserve natural resources. So a lot of this money will kind of work in parity with the money coming from the federal government. They're investing in a lot of the same issues, but this is more in depth, less on more on a statewide scale instead of the federal scale. So this is something that is very important in moving us into the future. So to give you a little breakdown of where the money's going, in this Bond Act, the state has issued $4.2 billion to be bonded out. That is a significant amount of money. So there is $650 million for water quality and resilience infrastructure, $1.1 billion for restoration and flood risk reduction, $650 million for open space conservation and recreation, and $1.5 billion for climate change mitigation. Additionally, I want to point out that there is also $500 million that has been issued for electric school buses. So this is something, I think that's, definitely has a bigger impact in New York City than the rest of the state, but tailpipe emissions coming from school buses. We talk about air pollution and particle pollution around more urban areas, and a lot of that's, coming out of tailpipes. So if we can start cutting down those emissions now, opposed to later, then we'll start to see kids with less asthma and less other breathing conditions. So it's very important that we get this passed so we can start seeing the benefits of it. Additionally, in the Bond Act, there's about $1.4 billion that will be going to disadvantaged communities. So this is, it is in the statute that the disadvantaged communities will receive at least 30% or 35% of the benefits of the funds pursuant to the article. So what is a disadvantaged community? Disadvantaged communities are communities that bear burdens of negative public health effects, environmental pollution, impacts of climate change, and possess certain socioeconomic criteria or comprise high concentrations of low and moderate income households. If you think about the communities that that kind of describes historically, it's mostly Black and brown communities, first generation American communities, and then also poor rural communities. So I'm going to try to bring up a map of. Can you see the map? No, yeah. So this is a map of all the disadvantaged communities around New York State. As you can see, as you can see, you go into New York City, and like Matt said earlier, the communities that really hit the hardest are Harlem, parts of the Bronx, Brooklyn, and then that's the same around New York State. For Rochester, for instance, most of Rochester is considered disadvantaged community. So that's where a good portion of the funds will be going, to kind of right the historical wrongs that have happened around the state. All right, so a little bit of a breakdown on the different categories of where the money is going to be going. Like I said, $650 million for water quality improvement and resilient infrastructure. That's at least $200 million for wastewater infrastructure upgrades. I think we've all heard the horror stories about wastewater getting into the Hudson River, for instance. We want to really cut that down. Hopefully someday we'll be able to eat the fish out of the Hudson River instead of dealing with the generations of pollution. At least $250 million for municipal stormwater projects. Then there's a ton of additional funding to reduce harmful algae blooms. That's not really something I'm sure you guys see down in the city a lot, but upstate that's a real problem. Extend or establish sewer lines. Again, New York City already has established sewer lines, but there is money to reinvest in our sewer systems and upgrade them. Also reduce lead exposure by replacing lead service lines. I think that's a major piece. Okay. So, like I said, again, $650 million for open space conservation, and of that, at least $300 million for land conservation. I don't know if you all are familiar with a goal set nationally to conserve 30% of federal land by the year 2030. This is kind of set in place to help protect biodiversity, protect wetlands, and protect the lands that act as buffers when we have severe weather events that can really bear the brunt of that. $150 million for farmland preservation, That's not really something that's going to help New York City. I believe there's a farm in Queens, but that I think is a bit. $75 million for fish hatchery creation and upgrades. Again, it's not really going to affect New York City. Okay. $1.5 billion for climate change. So, what is, any type of climate change?
You're breaking up a little bit. You're breaking up just a little bit.
All right. Can you see the show?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right. So climate change mitigation. We have $1.5 billion for climate change mitigation. And this has to do with really facing the challenges of climate change head on, preparing infrastructure, investing in clean energies, really getting ready for what the future is going to hold. So like I said earlier, $500 million for zero emission school buses, $400 million for green buildings, energy efficiency or renewable energy on state-owned properties, $200 million for air and water pollution elimination, environmental justice communities, $100 million for climate adaptation and mitigation projects, and then a whole list of other projects, but urban forestry projects help planting trees in urban areas, as we know that they act as great carbon sinks, but also communities that have more trees tend to be healthier. They absorb a lot of the harmful pollution that's causing negative health effects. And then additionally, $1.1 billion for restoration and flood risk reduction. That's $100 million for coastal rehabilitation and shoreline restoration, $100 million to reduce inland flooding and revitalize waterfronts, $250 million for flood buyouts and associated costs. I mean, as we've seen year in and year out, how often have New York City, Long Island been battered by incredibly more violent storms than we historically have, and that's just going to continue to get worse as the world gets warmer and climate change hits us harder. Yeah. So another great thing that will come out of the Bond Act is that it will create about $8.7 billion in project spending. And that translates to roughly 84,000 jobs in New York State. And like Matt said about the jobs created under the IRA, these jobs will be good middle class jobs that will help people sustain healthy jobs, but also be able to live and work in the communities that the money is going to be spent in. We see a lot where there's transit labor, people can't live in the communities they're working in, but this will hopefully help to address that. So what we're asking for you guys, what you can do is make sure you're registered to vote. October 14th is the voter registration deadline. You can change your address up until October 19th. And obviously New York State, it's very easy to vote. You can vote by absentee ballot, vote early, and then vote on election day. And the most important thing about this is making sure to turn over the ballot and voting on the propositions. That's a key that we see a lot. People will make sure to vote for their candidates, but forget to flip over the ballot and vote on the propositions. Here are some resources. We would love it if you signed on and took the pledge to vote. We have some information on voter registration. And yeah, please follow us, New York Bond Act, and make sure to vote on November 8th.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Really lovely presentation, and those links that you have at the end there, I'm gonna make sure to follow up with everyone. I'll send out an email with those links. I'm also gonna send a recording of this video too. And before we go in for the Q&A, I just want to share a couple more slides here. Just a little bit more information on upcoming events that we have. Really exciting news. Next month, we're going to have in-person events again. So it's going to be on Grassroots Retrofits, October 20th. Location TBD, but it will be in Midtown. And then we also have a careers events centering around women entrepreneurs and sustainability. I think that's earlier in October. We're still figuring out that date and location, but stay tuned for that. And now we can get started in Q&A. I have let's see. We have one question already. All right, there's from is there a incoming revenue stream inherent in the Bond Act, or will the bonds be paid out over time from the state's government's existing budget, aka taxes? So that is for you, Andrew.
Yeah, do you mind repeating that? I missed the first part. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can open up the chat too and read it, but I'll read it again for everyone. Is there an incoming revenue stream inherent in the Bond Act, or will the bonds be paid out over time from the state?
Yeah, so the one revenue stream is obviously the sale of bonds that the state allows the comptroller to issue. So that's first and foremost the first revenue stream. As for if they don't sell enough bonds, I know they're issued to sell over the cost of the bonds. If they don't sell enough, I don't know where the money comes from, but I can follow up with you on that.
Cool. That's actually one of the things I was wondering about. Why is it a Bond Act? Why do legislators say this piece of legislation is going to be a Bond Act rather than just passing sweeping things and just making it law themselves? What exactly is going on there?
Right. No, that's a good question. So why do they bond it out? So instead of putting it, say, in the budget, right, it's bonded out to allow the state to take on the debt.
Okay, so it's just an alternative revenue stream.
Exactly. And it has to be voted on by the voters for them to take on $4.2 billion debt.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Here's another question. This one's for you, Matt. Does the
actually,
IRA...
real quick, Harris, I think there's a follow-up to that the person had some clarification.
Oh, did they? Oh,
yeah, at the bottom.
Oh, okay. She says, my question is more, how will the government pay back the bonds after it matures?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna have to follow up with that. I can leave my contact in here. But from my understanding is out of taxes. But I do want to follow up.
Okay, noted. All right, so this next question, does the IRA include any particular mandates that the federal government or states need to abide by? Some concerns about states resisting use of the funds for political reasons.
Yeah, so a lot of the IRA benefits for companies or for projects are tied to specific labor rules. It's about whether or not you provide a prevailing wage and whether or not you provide apprenticeship programs to your people. These are a lot of the labor negotiations that ended up in it. But in terms of the state, the beneficial thing is that a lot of this is done through the federal tax code. So a lot of times you can bypass bypass state governments that aren't willing to participate or, want to cut their nose off to spite themselves. But there are certain ones that do apply to that. State building codes, for example. The Department of Energy in this package is going to be offering up some funds and also some prescriptions about how to update building codes. And it's similar to the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, where it's really up to the states whether or not they want to comply with that or not.
Interesting. Okay, we have another question from Gregory as well. Back to you, Andrew. In regards to the Bond Act, does a project like capping the Cross Bronx Expressway fit into something those funds might go to, especially as congestion pricing gets closer to being implemented and cause traffic to significantly increase across that roadway? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so can you just elaborate? I'm not familiar with this, capping the Cross Bronx.
Oh,
Yeah,
so
I can. You probably know about Harris. Go ahead.
Oh, so he's referring somehow. I almost feel like this is probably more of like an IRA funded things. I know the federal government has been talking a lot about how highways kind of segregate communities, and one of the ways to rectify that is to cap them to kind of, connect communities again and to reduce emissions from the highways. But that might come funding from the Bond Act, or the IRA. I'm not sure.
There would definitely be funds in there for something like that. Yeah, in the Bond Act at least. I'm not sure about the IRA. I'll let Matt get into that.
Yeah, because I know like Pete Buttigieg, for instance, has talked a lot about reducing highway expansions.
Yep. So there is actually some money for infrastructure projects about so that it's a little open-ended about some of these funds to help communities directly. And that was also sort of part of Manchin's thing. It could be used to do local projects that reduce air pollution, but it, improve bike lanes, for example, something like that. But it could also be used for widening highways, for example. It's really at the discretion of the municipality and the folks getting for it.
Right, because some municipalities will argue that widening highways reduces traffic, which reduces emissions, which not true, folks, not true.
Right.
Speaking of funds too, Andrew, you mentioned that there's like $1 billion for the restoration and flood mitigation for the coast, and I'm like really excited for this Bond Act to get passed, and that money is so important. But it's still not, it's hard not to feel like it's a bit daunting still when the East River Park project that's going underway is multiple billions of dollars just in and of itself, and it only stretches like 2.5 miles of just a little piece of Manhattan. It's like both the IRA and the Bond Act are really seem like we're finally heading in the right direction, and these are going to happen. But I feel like in another 5 years this has to happen again and again and again, because it's just the first step, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also an issue happening in other parts of the state. There are rising waters in Oswego County, the Great Lakes that have really bad issues with flooding as well. So this is definitely just a start. This is just an initial shot of money, but it's going to have to continue, because these projects are going to have to keep happening, because otherwise we're going to be underwater.
That's right. I'm wondering if people want to open up their mics, and if you want to ask a question too, like, it's totally fine as well. We just got another question in the chat though. How does one avail themselves for rebates, incentives in retrofitting a house to a passive house? We just actually had a forum all about passive houses. Hashi, I can send you a link to that forum, because that question is definitely answered in there very extensively. But if either of you have any insight into that, you can elaborate more.
Sure. I don't think I've seen any language in it about adapting, windows, for example, to be more beneficial for some passive solar to come in. But what they do have is retrofitting your house to have better insulation and to change your appliances and to change out your water heater and things like that. So while I don't think there are any specific provisions in it that would help you, for example, I don't know, take down a wall or something and put up glass, it does help you insulate the house that you already have.
Yeah, I think that's a really big part that a lot of people, they kind of just focus on electrification, or they focus on renewable energy, but so much. And the thing is too, when the less and less we use fossil fuels, the more demand for electricity is going to go up. And especially with electric cars, I mean, I did see that, since the IRA has been passed, they've changed the projections for how much of the percentage of the cars in the US will be electric. And there's like a significant bump to it, but that's just going to be a lot of demand on the grid. So I feel like a lot of portion of this funding should also be towards efficient.
Yep.
And just reducing energy, reducing the amount of miles people have to drive, public transit, it's all connected. And that also needs to be like a really big focus. So I hope that there's funds for increasing passive house, because that is such an important thing to focus on. All right, we have another question too. I was actually curious about this as well. With us being in the middle of high inflation, high interest rate environment with a potential recession looming, what are your top concerns as they relate to the implementation of the IRA and Bond Act?
Yeah, I can take this one. So when it comes to the Bond Act, most of the money it's going to, funding capital projects or funding, infrastructure projects. So I guess to answer your question, for me, what is, the biggest fear with being in a high inflation environment is that we're going to be paying a premium for all of that comes with that, that comes with, capital projects that come with construction. So we're going to be paying more than we would if we were in a low inflation, time period. That's a great question. That's not something we really discuss all that often. I think we get all excited about the big numbers, but then we have to think about the realities on the ground that, what are 2022 dollars really going to get you?
Yep. And as for the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the goals of it is to lower energy costs. You do that by making energy cheaper, because we're producing more on scale for clean renewable energy, which is cheaper. There are going to be less supply chain issues because you're going to be producing things domestically. That's going to bring down costs. Like we were just talking about with energy efficiency, you're going to be spending less because you're going to be using less energy, because you can retrofit your home to be more insulated, because you can get better appliances that use less energy. There are quite a number of incentives. They'll pay for about 30% solar installation on your house, which in turn will drastically reduce your energy costs. So also it's called the Inflation Reduction Act. Part of the point of it is trying to locally source domestic production, and then to also lower inflation by reducing the deficit by having that corporate 15% minimum tax, and to hiring more IRS agents and cracking down on tax cheats to ensure that we have an adequate revenue stream for these kinds of programs that will strengthen our economy over the long term and provide some relief to consumers in the short term.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that, Matt, because I was going to ask, I don't think you actually mentioned inflation in your presentation, which is a kind of ironic.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how much of it is kind of just was like a political move to name it the Inflation Reduction Act, or how much effect it's really going to have. But it sounds like the idea behind it is to kind of create like a self-funding cycle.
Yep.
Right. So yeah, thank you for answering that so well. I was wondering if anyone else had any questions. We can wrap up if no one else has anything else more to say. All right, I guess that could conclude it. I want to thank Matt and Andrew again so much, and I really want to thank the New York League of Conservation Voters. That organization and Green Home have had a long partnership in the past. We really appreciate you guys coming out to our forums and presenting with us. So yeah, as you know, I hope to see you guys at the next forum in October, and have a good night. Thank you guys so much.
Good night. Thanks.
Thank
Good
you.
night, thank you.